So this might seem like quite a funny thing to mention in like a conversation about tanking. Taunting isn't quite as simple as it may seem. It's not just one button. There is a lot more to taunting than meets the eye. So what is a taunt? Hopefully most of you guys know what a taunt is, but a taunt is a skill that's usually a single target skill that you use which forces an enemy to attack you. So when you pierce armor one enemy, that enemy will attack you and they'll stay focused on you for 15 seconds. ESO doesn't really support AoE taunting, and you can only single target taunt unless you run a specific setup of gear and skills. So AoE taunting isn't a thing in the game. The only way to achieve that is to use like the Tormentor set and use a certain skill that causes damage as an AoE to force them to attack you. But generally, in the game, they've kind of made a point to not make AoE taunts. And the reason for that is they want you to focus on taunting priority adds. So they don't really support AoE taunting, and they've said they're not going to put one in the game. They mentioned that from the start. They've mentioned it many times in the past. But yeah, they don't like the idea of AoE taunting. And a lot of other games do use an AoE taunt feature or an AoE threat feature, which creates that situation where you can grab like a whole pack of enemies at once. We don't have that option on ESO, so we have to focus single target things onto each enemy, single target taunts, and just focus on one thing at a time. And that's why we have to focus priority targets when we are tanking. And then aggro is keeping hold of an enemy for a prolonged period of time, usually with a taunt. Werewolf tank for the win. Yeah, werewolf. I mean, with a werewolf, you can use Pounce and Tormentor. Obviously, it's not suitable for tank and everything, but it is good fun. Like, I would definitely suggest that people go out there and make a werewolf tank and try some AoE taunting, because it is a hell of a lot of fun. However, for most content, it's just not really an option. It's good for a laugh. It's good for a bit of a joke, and you can even do it in, like, kind of chilled out random runs of stuff. But overall, you're not going to use it for endgame content, and you're not going to use the Tormentor set, because it means you're using a 5-piece set to taunt. When you've got a skill that can taunt, using a 5-piece set to do the same thing, that's the only reason why it's not really much of an option for most stuff. So there's different types of taunts in the game. Now this is what people don't, this is the information that usually people aren't really that knowledgeable about. So there is, I mean, the names like hard taunt, medium taunt, soft taunt, they're not really the actual names of these things. I've kind of named them that to make it easier to understand what it is that it means. So like a hard taunt is something where you use a skill and it forces that enemy for 15 seconds to attack you, and it's not really easy. That can't be broken unless somebody else taunts that enemy. Like that enemy is fixed onto you for that period of time. So that is a hard taunt. So puncture, in a fire, frost clench, those skills are hard taunts. Hard taunts are essential, and you must always be applied to bosses and elite targets, and for other enemies when it's possible as well. But bosses and elite targets always want to be hard taunted. You never want to not use a hard taunt on those enemies, because that means they're potentially just going to run off. Medium taunts, so things that chain enemies. So Unrelenting Grip and Silver Leash do have a taunt feature locked inside that process. So medium taunts help you to quickly gain aggro on multiple enemies and position them. Which it's usually like weaker adds though in ad pulls. So when you use chains and you chain an enemy, that enemy will be aggroed to you. It's called the Fiery Grip taunt. And same with Silver Leash. Silver Leash has the Fiery Grip taunt as well. And it's just a quick 2-second taunt where the enemy will only attack you for 2 seconds. If somebody uses a hard taunt on an enemy that is medium taunted, so if you chain something in and then somebody else was to taunt that enemy would then go to the person with the hard taunt. So a hard taunt overtakes a medium taunt. So like a chained in taunt is not really like a solid taunt. It's just something that like it is a thing. So when you chain an enemy, it does get taunted to you for 2 seconds. And this is why in dungeon content, chains and talons is so powerful, because you can chain things in, and when you chain it in, they're aggroed to you, so they get stuck on you. And this is why things like the Vatishran sword and board isn't as good as chains and talons in one sense, because when you use the Vatishran sword and board and you use the power bash and it pulls everything in, those enemies don't get aggroed because it doesn't apply the taunt. So they get pulled in and then they fucking run away. So it's a big problem using that in that sort of content. So you need to make sure you've got a good crowd control skill if you are using the Vatishran one-handed shield, because that doesn't count as the Fire Grip Taunt. Only Unrelenting Grip, Silver Leash, Frozen Device maybe. I'm not going to say for sure. I think the Frozen Device is also a medium taunt. Those three things are, but things I don't think Swarm Mother is either. I don't think that aggro's enemies to you either, because they're not skills. It's only skills that are used that pull enemies in that cause that taunt. But like I say, the medium taunt isn't a strong taunt because it only lasts for a couple of seconds, but it's a good way to crowd control enemies because you can chain things really quick. Chain, and then you use your talons and they're aggro to you, so they stay there for a couple of seconds and then you talons them and then they can die. And then you can chain them all again if you wanted to. Even enemies that are CC immune, you can chain them and they will aggro to you. You can chain bosses and they will aggro to you, but only for 2 seconds. So in things like Cloud Rest, let's say you've got bar swap in Cloud Rest, you've gone onto your back bar, you don't have a taunt on your back bar, but you've got a chain. You could spam chains on the boss, and that would keep the enemy aggro to you. So that is a kind of clever way to think of certain mechanics like that. You can chain the enemy to taunt them to you. In VMOL, in more of Lorcaj, I've seen people do the start bit of the fight. You know, you've got the 2 tanks and the 2 bosses on the twins. I've seen the tanks just chain those bosses to start the fight. And then what happens is, when you have to do the switch like 3 or 4 seconds later, there's no problem with taunt immunity because they were only chain taunted. So they weren't hard taunted, they were chain taunted. And then when you use a hard taunt on a medium taunted enemy, they will go to the hard taunt because the medium taunt isn't like a proper official, like, locked in taunt. So that is a little way to just kind of look at a few situations with medium taunting. Then we've got kind of soft taunts and soft aggro. And that means you're the only person in range or you're the biggest threat target. So sometimes soft taunts are used for situations where you run ahead of your group or you pull something away from other people and you maintain aggro. So for example, in some trials, the main tank will take the first ad pull, the off tank will take the second ad pull, the main tank will take the third ad pull, and you take it in turns to take each ad pull and the next person runs ahead. And you don't have to taunt those enemies because what will happen is the group's so far away, they get soft aggroed. So you run into an ad pull, you cast blockade on the ground so that you've hit the enemy, and then they can only attack you because you're the only person doing damage to them. So you're the biggest threat. So the enemy is aggroed to you. It's not really a taunt because you're not doing anything that taunts them and locks them in. As soon as group members get over to a soft taunted pack of ads, for example, those ads would just run off very, very quickly. To the other enemies. To the other allies. So soft taunting is something that you might do. It's often used in certain trial situations. So if you are the off tank in Hellrot and you're doing the strategy where you take all the gargoyles to the entrance, you don't actually have to taunt any of those gargoyles. What you do is you get aggro of the gargoyles and you run to the entrance of Hellrot, and then you just run around. And because they're so far away from everybody else in your group, they won't ever leave your side. They will just stay aggro to you. And it's the same in places like Sanctum Ophidia. On the last boss there, you've got 2 Lamias, and you can just taunt them once and run away from the group to the stairs, and then you just run around, and they won't de-aggro because you're the only enemy. So they are soft taunted to you because nobody else is nearby. So that's what soft taunting is. Soft taunting is just a situation where things aggro to you because you are the only person nearby, or you're the only threat. So when you put down like a blockade, things stay aggroed on you because everyone else is too far away and you're the only one doing damage to those enemies, so they stay attacking you because you are the threat, you are causing damage, so they stay with you. Next thing with taunting, there is a thing called taunt immunity. Now this is something that people don't seem to understand it too well, but we'll try and cover as much as we can about it without confusing people. So taunt immunity is something that can happen in the game. So it's an effect that can happen to the enemy. You cannot make an enemy taunt immune by yourself. So if you just spam taunt on the enemy, they will not become taunt immune. So if anybody tries to tell you different, it's not possible that the enemy becomes taunt immune just from you taunting them. However, when multiple people try to taunt the same enemy within a short space of time, this makes the enemy immune to taunts. So if you are spamming taunt on the enemy and then somebody else comes along and taunts it, that will make taunt immunity. Like, you will cause a problem with taunt immunity and taunt problems by spamming taunt on an enemy and then somebody else coming along and taunting it if you do need to switch a boss for whatever reason. So taunt immunity is a 12-second kind of debuff where you cannot get a hard taunt on the enemy for 12 seconds. So if you create this taunt immunity situation, it becomes a problem because that enemy can run loose. If the taunt that's applied to it runs out and you've still got time left on the taunt immunity, that enemy can run away and start attacking other people. So you want to avoid spamming taunt on the enemy, basically. It's kind of a hidden timer and debuff. And you can track it with add-ons on PC. So there is a very good add-on called Please Just Debuff. If you look at that on like Minion or ESO UI, it's one that I use and it's supported by the Tank Club. And that will track taunt immunity. So that is how I follow taunt immunity. When I'm trying to swap bosses or somebody accidentally taunts my boss, I can look at the little timer and I say, right, I've got 6 seconds left of taunt immunity, so I can't grab it yet. And we can kind of look at it that way. So there is things like that in the game. There are add-ons you can use. If you're on console, I don't believe there is a way to actually figure it out. You just have to wait and keep taunting it and hope for the best. It's hard to track since taunt lasts 15 seconds and taunt immunity only occurs in a 12-second window. So every time you taunt the boss, it doesn't reset the 12-second taunt immunity timer window. So it's really it's a really weird thing to try and avoid. The best way to avoid taunt immunity is to not taunt the enemy too often. So reset your taunt every 13-14 seconds. Don't cast it too often, especially bosses that sometimes have to be switched. So let's say Zamaja, you have to switch bosses to switch who's going in the portal, and things like that. So you don't want to spam taunts on the enemy. You don't want to spam taunts on St. Olms in like Asylum Sanctorium. Because if you're spamming taunts on it, and then the off-tank comes along and taunts it by accident, you then can't get it back. If you let the taunt timer run down to 13-14 seconds, if the off-tank then taunts it, you are able to then taunt it back straight away, but then it gets taunt immunity after you've got aggro. So it's a really complicated behind-the-scenes feature that you need to be careful of. Don't cast taunts too often because you will create taunt immunity, especially if there's like accidents where multiple people are taunting, or if you have to swap bosses or swap aggro of bosses. So just be very, very careful with it, and then it won't happen. If you are accidentally taunting bosses a lot and you are casting too much taunts, you're taunting too often, taunting too frequently, and then somebody else comes along and taunts as well, you will have this issue quite a lot. But just remember, the big thing is you cannot make taunt immunity by yourself. So if you keep spamming taunt on the enemy and there's only you taunting it, it's impossible for the enemy to then become taunt immune and then run off or start attacking other people. So anyone who tries to tell you different from that, it's not true, and they are basically losing aggro.